This episode is brought to you by iZotope. Our friends over at iZotope create the most thoughtfully and intuitively designed software for audio repair, mixing, and mastering. I use their tools every day for the podcast, and I love it. And I think you will too. Go over to iZotope.com and check it out. That's iZotope.com, iZotope. Use the code FRET10 at checkout for a 10% discount. That's all caps, F-R-E-T, and the number 10. Welcome to Discograffiti's 2025 Patreon membership super drive. Now more than ever with our Beach Boys series underway, much of which will be living exclusively on our Patreon platform, this is the time to join, and I'm going to make it super easy for you. At the lieutenant or major tier, in addition to 3 or 4 shows a week, access to the gigantic archive of Patreon back episodes, and your backstage pass, you'll also get the following. An onboarding call with me during which you'll tell me all your ideas on how to make the podcast you'd like to hear. And whether I use all, some, or none of your ideas, I'll have listened closely and most importantly, gotten to know you. Plus, 3 months into your membership, you'll be eligible to appear on the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. That's right, an entire episode all about you, your band, your band's album, your band's tour, or whatever other cool stuff you might be up to. And not only do we make the episode, we promote it for you too. Last but not least, you'll receive a completely free digital copy of Metal Machine Muzak, which otherwise costs $11. Metal Machine Muzak is Discograffiti's double album Lou Reed tribute featuring 16-minute pieces by Lou Barlow from Sebadoh and Dino Jr., Corey Hansen from Wand, Mark Robinson from Unrest, and W. Cullen Hart from Olivia Tremor Control. Please tell all your music-obsessive friends. In fact, if your friends do sign up, be sure to email me at info@discograffiti.com and let me know who they are, because I'll be sending you an additional surprise gift on top of everything else as a token of my gratitude. And now, without further ado, the greatest music commentary podcast in all the land, I bring you Discograffiti. Denny's new movie, The Immediate Family, we're talking about guys like Danny Korchmar, Waddy, Russ Kunkel, Leland Sklar. Did you guys feel toward those guys as the Byrds felt toward you?
Not at all. We worked with together.
Okay.
Leland worked with us. Russ Kunkel worked with us. You know, those guys. I never worked with Cooch Kochmeyer. I never worked with him or the other guys, but I worked with some of them. A lot of times I would be called in to overdub a part that they had fucked up, whereas I was brought in after the fact. So there you have it.
Well, there's no keyboards in the Immediate Family band, so let's make sure that we got that correct.
Right. Welcome to another episode of Discograffiti's wildly in-depth Beach Boys series and Your Dreams Come True, where Brian Wilson freaks like you and me get our chance to delve deep into the barely believable history and prodigious discography of my favorite band of all time, and also coincidentally the best, along with a slew of over 50 top-shelf guests, ranging from musicians inspired by their work, family members, documentary directors, songwriting collaborators, Beach Boys authors, producers, touring band members, and for good measure, some of the Beach Boys themselves. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow. Special thanks goes out to Jeff McAvoy and especially co-producers Dennis Dyken and Mark Freed, without whom this series would not have happened. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the Beach Boys Stack of Tracks and the Wrecking Crew, along with our special guests, Wrecking Crew pianist Don Randi and music doc director Denny Tedesco. Here's just a few of the many things that Don and Denny discuss in this podcast. Details about Denny's upcoming third music doc, the very different original track listing for Stack of Tracks, the origin story and early days of the Wrecking Crew, the many reasons for the disbursement of that classic group of great players, The resentments of the band members who wound up being replaced on their records by the 1960 session guys. If Don really knew that Brian was a genius at the time without the benefit of hindsight, plus some background on the ill-fated 1992 Phil Spector session with the Wrecking Crew that never quite came off. If you're a Beach Boys superfan like me, you'll want to turn this free version off right now and opt for the director's cut of this episode on our Patreon page, which features 23 additional minutes of essential material. And you can find it in our Patreon shop for mere pennies at patreon.com/discograffiti/shop. Or better yet, just subscribe for access to the complete versions of all our shows. I recommend the Lieutenant tier at the very least so you can access those director's cuts, but the major tier's what you want if you want it all. Even if you're on the fence, just head over there because it's finally free to become a basic member. Coming up, we've got Al Jardine, Marilyn Wilson, Don Was, Ginger Blake, Pete Buck, Ira Kaplan from Yo La Tengo, The Cars' Elliot Easton, Don Fleming, Marshall Crenshaw, Russ Titleman, Jerry Schilling, Greg Jacobson, Christian Love, Gary Griffin, David Beard, Probin Gregory, John Cowsill, Rob Bonfilio, Wyatt Funderburk, Stephen Kalinich, Matt Jardine, Fred Vale, Sam Parker, Brent Wilson, Mark Lynette, Alan Boyd, Carly Minoz, and many more. So don't miss out. Open up your listening app right now and subscribe. And away we go then. Today we've got two guests. Today's first guest is a keyboard player, band leader, club owner, songwriter, an esteemed member of the Wrecking Crew, and an all-around mensch. Raised in the Catskills, he headed west to LA in 1954 to become a studio musician. Who does that? By the early 1960s, he was a musician and arranger for Phil Spector, and thus one of the original architects of the Wall of Sound. He played piano on Nancy Sinatra's These Boots Are Made for Walkin', as well as on her albums, and has been a member of her touring band for decades. You may also remember him from the Buffalo Springfield's Broken Arrow, from the harpsichord that graces the Stone Pony's Different Drum, all over the classic David Axelrod albums, including Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, and Earth Rot. On the Crystals' He's a Rebel, Da Do Ron Ron, and Then He Kissed Me. On the Jackson 5's ABC, on the Righteous Brothers' You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', Ebb Tide, and Unchained Melody, Sonny and Cher's I Got You Babe, Leslie Gore's It's My Party, and the Ronettes' Be My Baby, and let's not forget the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, Help Me Rhonda, Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows, and Smile. The man claims to have played on over 300 hit records, but I think he's rounding down. He recorded live albums of piano jazz as a solo performer and as the leader of the Don Randi trio with Leroy Vinegar and Mel Lewis. In 1970, he opened the Baked Potato Jazz Club in Studio City and formed Don Randi and Quest as the house band, who went on to record over 15 albums. 55 years later, the Baked Potato is now the longest-running jazz club in L.A. He's a returning guest to the hallowed halls of Discograffiti, first on episode 17, where he discussed and rated the entire career of his friend and collaborator, David Axelrod, and then once again for a career retrospective on episode 73, but he's back, lads and ladies, to toss down his 2 cents on a topic about which he knows a hell of a lot more than you or I. He's the Sultan of Sweetness, the Michelangelo of Modesty. Would you please gasp sycophantically for Don Randi?
Oh, my goodness.
Today's second guest started his film career as a set decorator on feature films such as the Paul Bartel black comedy classic Eating Raoul. After graduating college, he worked as a grip and electrician on music videos for the Ramones, Sting, Chicago, Billy Idol, Janet Jackson, Robbie Neville, the Beach Boys, and many more. In 1996, after his father, Wrecking Crew guitarist Tommy Tedesco, was diagnosed with terminal cancer, his focus shifted on a dime. He got to work producing and directing the documentary The Wrecking Crew, which includes interviews with Cher, Brian Wilson, Glenn Campbell, Leon Russell, Herb Alpert, Nancy Sinatra, Mickey Dolenz, Roger McGuinn, Don Randi, and lots more. Self-financed and winning numerous awards over the years, this man raised the $750,000 needed to pay off the hefty music licensing rights through a smash success Kickstarter campaign, and the film was picked up for distribution by Magnolia Pictures. After a very successful theatrical run, it's now enjoying a healthy life on Netflix. It's one of the best music documentaries there is. Although initially hesitant to make a follow-up to it, when he was approached with the idea for what became his second music doc, he says he didn't think twice, and it's easy to see why. The Immediate Family is a film about a group of studio dudes who helped usher in the singer-songwriter era and were to the 70s what the Wrecking Crew were to the 60s. We're talking about guitarist Danny Korchmar, Waddy Wachtel, and Steve Postel, bassist Leland Sklar, and drummer Russ Kunkel. Although he's made 2 incredible music docs in a row, I can't help but feel sorry for him, since his next movie, starring the computers that made the music for the MTV era stars of the 1980s, sure seems devoid of inherent dramatic value. But hey, that's life. Tommy had to have been so proud of what he begat. Please welcome my music lover brother from another mother, Denny Tedesco.
Wow. That's something. I didn't know how you were going to fill the time, but you did really well.
Seriously, what are you going to do, Denny, about the 1980s?
Actually, it's funny because I just started Manhattan Transfer. It's a different look, different vibe, but it is the 80s, 70s and 80s. That just came to I was very fortunate a couple months ago. Alan Paul of the Manhattan Transfer came to me and said, we started this years ago, but we never got anywhere. Would you be interested in taking it over? And I was a huge fan of that group, and I loved it. And that's what I'm doing now. So I interviewed David Foster, and I interviewed Jimmy Jam recently.
Nice.
And the group, and that's what I'm doing.
That's amazing. So you're already actually doing work proper on the follow-up?
Yeah. Well, it takes a long time with documentaries. You could start them, you try to get some seed money, you get that going, and then you hopefully you try to find financing. Everybody thinks, there's so many of them. Well, that's the problem. There are so many of them.
Yeah.
And it's a fight to, I'm very, very fortunate to have 2 films that are actually distributed by Magnolia Films.
I've made 2 features as a writer, producer, director, both picked up for distribution. Both of those movies, I raised just enough money to shoot them and wound up getting the money during the editing for the remainder, not even knowing if I'd be able to finish either of them.
It's hard. I mean, It is, listen, we're doing it because we want to do it. So, I just hopefully it gets easier because maybe if I get better at it, I'm hoping.
I went and rewatched The Wrecking Crew. I'd seen it previously, but you hit it out of the park on that one right at from the get-go. The movie's got a lot of heart. It's not just history. You feel for all the guys. And
I think that's what documentaries need to have. It could be, yes, it's going to give you a message. It's going to tell you something. But these documentaries, they could easily be a jukebox doc. Don did this, Tommy did this, Hal did this, But if there's nothing else other than music, if you don't get down and why they do it, what they really went through, it doesn't mean anything because the audience doesn't relate to it.
So when you were growing up, was it Uncle Don, or were you guys not really as close as you are now?
No, it's funny, I think, and Don will remember this, I don't think I ever met Don. I might have met Don once or twice as a kid, maybe at the Baked Potato. Dad never took us to work. I didn't really know Don until I interviewed him.
Wow.
And then we became best of friends. And it's weird. When I interviewed Don, he was 61. I'm 64 yesterday.
Wow.
So thanks, Don, for the happy birthday. But that's beside the point, Don. I forget about it. But the fact is, Don and I have spent more time together than probably my father and he did. Because Dad and him spent more of their time in the 60s. Yeah. Right, Don? I mean, it's kind of interesting that our friendship has gone longer than theirs.
And, one thing that was really heartwarming, Denny, to see in the film is your mom being so understanding toward your dad about, he didn't carry any guilt with him to work about, not being around. It was what he did.
Look, there was no guilt. My father had no guilt.
Yeah. But that's great. Imagine having that, because what Hal was talking about, it ruined, at least, for some of his life, it ruined his life.
Yeah, well,
being married to Hitler is like that,
Yeah.
Jesus.
So let's dive headfirst into the meat and potatoes of this thing, because we have a lot of stuff to cover. So first, before we actually get started proper, usually I do a threading thing at the beginning of the episode when we last saw our boys. But let's forget about that for now, because this episode is an outlier that exists outside of and independent to the Beach Boys timeline, as something of a drum roll to the majestic greatness of season 3, which will be an exhaustive deep dive into literally my 2 favorite albums in music history, Pet Sounds and Smile, but not in that order. I felt we needed some sort of red carpet build-up to this era of the Beach Boys. And what better way to celebrate than to take the black sheep of the band's catalog, stack of tracks, dislocate it from its era of release, which was 1968, and slot it in to a place in the timeline when most of its tracks were actually recorded. And thus, I present to you all a very special episode, Stack of Tracks and the Wrecking Crew. Let's start with The Road to Getting Your Due. So, according to Kent Hartman, who wrote a book in 2012 called The Wrecking Crew, The Inside Story of Rock and Roll's Best Kept Secret, if a rock and roll song came out of an LA recording studio from between about 62 and 72, the odds are good that some combination of the Wrecking Crew played the instruments. But it took a long time for people to actually realize that you all even existed, right? You were the music industry's best kept secret for a long time. Don, your gang was formed in the late 50s. It was originally known as The Click or the First Call Gang, and headed up by Ray Pullman. Pullman being one of the first session musicians in LA to use an electric bass in recordings. First off, I didn't know that Ray was sort of the, I guess, unofficial figurehead at first. When was there like kind of a shift to when Hal sort of became like more of the figurehead? And how did that wind up happening?
Well, possibly when Ray took on television shows, when he got into being the musical director, I think, for Shindig or one of those shows. And it kind of took him out of playing bass so much. And he was a marvelous arranger also. Most people don't realize that. He was doing arranging for other people. But I always thought he was a better guitar player than he was a bass player. He could play either very well. And he decided that he wanted to go more with being the leader at that point. And it kind of opened the door for a lot of other musicians because of that.
Well, I mean, so, what Ray did and what Hal did, being the quote unquote leader, were they really seen as the leader, or did you guys even need a sort of figurehead? And what were their responsibilities?
Well, it all depends who you worked for. If you worked for Phil Spector, it was more Hal Blaine, although he did use Earl Palmer on a number of occasions, and Earl was a big part of that. I would say more in my stead, getting me going was Jack Nitzsche, the arranger. He used me on a lot of stuff. He didn't always work for Phil Spector. He worked for a lot of other people, too, because he was such a great arranger. If we would have just had to exist on what Phil Spector did, we never would have become the Wrecking Crew, because we were doing all these different studios, all these different producers, and all these different record companies in those days. There were many. I was with Russ Titleman recently, and we got into a conversation, and he says, you always quote yourself wrong. I said, what do you mean? He says, you always say he's a rebel, was the first date I did. And that's what I thought. It was the first date I did with Phil Spector. But he said, no, the Paris Sisters was before that. And I had forgotten completely about that album that we had done. And I Love How He Loves Me is the key song from that. It became a big monster hit for the Paris Sisters.
So is that your first session you ever did?
Yeah, I think so.
Nice.
That took over from He's a Rebel.
Nice. Well, Russ is the greatest. Russ actually has been on the show many times in this series.
Yeah, yes.
Great guy. And also another thing is that the Wrecking Crew is a name chosen kind of way after the fact. The group had no official name in its early years. Here's a question that I have done. I've done so many interviews just for the Beach Boys series so far. And a lot of people think because Denny's movie had landed with such a splash, so many people have seen it and it's addressed an issue, and given you guys your place in history. Do you feel now that you guys, after getting all your due and becoming well known, now there's all these people that think that the Beach Boys never played at all on their own records? Do you feel like the seesaw has swung too far in the opposite direction and that history's been overcorrected? Basically, what the fuck is wrong with people's ability to understand things as they really are?
Well, unfortunately, in the very beginning, nobody ever knew us because our names were not on anything.
Right.
And then when they started to put our names on the back of albums, that's when everything came to question. And then they realized Brian was the first one to come out and say, look, I need those guys. They're important to me. I can get what I want done a lot faster than just going in with the guys themselves. And that was part of it. The capability for musicians to give a producer who didn't know what the hell he was talking about a hit record because we understood his bad verbalization of what he wanted. It's what we were capable of doing that. They didn't know how to verbalize, play more like Ray Charles or play more like Floyd Kramer to me or play something like that or play more like different guitar players would play. But they would verbalize it in strange ways, and we were able to give it to them.
Yeah.
And we became very important to them. And let me tell you something about the name, The Wrecking Crew. As far as I'm concerned, it's given me a whole other life. I mean, without that name, I go places, and that Wrecking Crew name is so important these days that people have to tell you, yeah, wow, you're one of the Wrecking Crew. And, yes, I am. And I'm very proud of it. But, we weren't that in the very beginning. We were just musicians. But that name is so iconic. It has become so famous now because of Denny and because of the movie. And I love it.
But what I'm addressing is, unless it's authors who come on and they really know history, most people, if it's, for example, a celebrity, if it's just a musician who loves the records, a lot of people who come on really don't even think that, for example, Dennis Wilson even played drums on the records. And he did. He didn't play on all the records.
Everybody picks and chooses. It's funny because I say that as well. I tell people, I said, listen, a lot of times at the beginning of albums, the Beach Boys always did their own music. The first ones they subbed out were Hal and Ray Pullman came in.
Denny, your movie was so successful that it actually created a different problem where now the band itself is not recognized for playing their own stuff.
Well, what's so really, here's the other funny part about it is how many people say they recorded with the Wrecking Crew or they were part of the Wrecking Crew. So there's all kinds of different, whatever, and let it go. In terms of marketing, what I'm proud of is the fact that these musicians, and as much as Carol hates the name and all that, I'm glad she got the recognition as being this fabulous bass player, guitar player. And unfortunately, she might not like the name, but you know what? It's a marketing tool. And I say that at the beginning of the movie. I say, this is a story. And when I brought the four of those musicians into the studio, I said, I brought four of LA top session players together in the studio. I didn't say four Wrecking Crew members because I knew that wasn't right. It wasn't right because it's not. If I said four of the Wrecking Crew members, that would have been wrong because Carol in her mind was never a Wrecking Crew member. It wasn't a real name. I'm playing with the name a little, playing with the idea. In the end, when I say I brought in these four studio musicians, for the great studio musicians, that's not wrong. I'm not saying anything wrong there. Some people remember the name and some people don't. And I kind of jux back and forth between, Larry leaving and going, no, I remember it. And the other one said, no, I don't remember it, And I said, some people remember numbers, 15, 26. And in the end, the message is, what I'm trying to say is it's not about numbers or names. It's about a time period.
I didn't realize that she didn't like the name. I just thought that she believed that it wasn't used initially. But, because it really is a marketing tool, it's only helpful if you were one of those musicians. It's interesting that she wouldn't get on board with that idea.
I think here's the thing with Carol. I think she took it too seriously at one point because how Hal was saying it, Hal said, these guys said they're going to wreck the business. And her response was, we didn't wreck the business. It's like not understanding the irony of what is being said, and then it gets into deeper stuff after her and Hal's relationship fell apart over the years.
Yeah.
That's another show, though.
My heart goes out to her because to be the only woman in a whole gang of I mean, let's face it, you guys were a bunch of cut-ups. In every shot, you guys are trying to make each other laugh, and it seems like a great environment. But to be a woman in that point in history, in unevolved period of history, and be caught in the middle of that could not have been easy.
I always said that. I mean, you just can't imagine. There are no guardrails.
You know what, guys? Who the fuck cares? Bottom line, we were there. We did the music. We played it. We gave our heart and soul to all that great music. And that's all that matters. What they want to call it. I mean, when you hear Herb Alpert referring to us as the Wrecking Crew, or Brian Wilson referring to us as the Wrecking Crew, that name wasn't even invented in that time, but they preferred that name because it's the real thing to them. Yeah. And to everybody else, let's get the guys from that band.
Yeah.
It's no accident that my favorite 2 albums in history are really just you guys. Pet Sounds and Smile. Now, as far as Pet Sounds, there's only one song that has the Beach Boys on it, and that's Not Me. Yeah. Besides That's Not Me, it's just you guys. And then on Smile, it's just you guys. As far as actual LPs that are a testament to whatever the hell you guys call yourselves, legacy, you can do no better than A Christmas Gift for You from Phil Spector from 1963, presenting the Fabulous Ronettes featuring Veronica from 64, the Righteous Brothers' Greatest Hits. I mean, you can't get better than that. The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, the Smile Sessions box set, and of course, the Beach Boys' stack of tracks, even though not quite all the tracks feature the Wrecking Crew on them. So before we go any further with your gang of musicians, let's talk about the odd history behind this outlier of an LP. Oh, hi, I'm Dave Gebrow. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 5-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate weekly podcast for music obsessives thrive. But weekly wasn't enough for me, so I bumped it up to 4 shows a week. Becoming a subscriber to Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to hundreds of exclusive episodes. As a 2-show-per-week private, you get the weekly show by and for our Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. As a 3-show-a-week lieutenant, you'll get early release, ad-free, extended director's cuts of the main show. They're the shows as they were intended to be heard. Plus, you'll gain access to half the Patreon archive and the upcoming Beach Boys Behind the Mirror companion episodes, which will feature dozens of special guests from within the Beach Boys camp talking about and rating their music. But as a 4-show-per-week major, you'll be drowning in a flood of must-hear binge listening, because I'll be bombarding you with episodes about super cool bands that are too subterranean for free Fridays. It's like going to music college, but with a tuition that makes all kinds of sense. Plus, our entire Patreon archive is yours. Discograffiti's Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, and the Private Press with Paul Major. And all that for the price of only a cup of coffee a week. Times are tough, you say? Fret not, because there's a $1 tier. Or you could just join as a basic member and buy episodes piecemeal from our Patreon shop. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Check out patreon.com/discograffiti to find the tier that's right for you. Once again, that's patreon.com/discograffiti. Stack of Tracks came out in 1968. The very first date on the timeline for this record is January 9th, 1968. The half-inch masters are pulled and a comp reel is assembled. And at this early point, the track order was as follows, and I'll tell you which songs actually did not make it to the record, but the instrumental tracks were pulled. It was going to start off with You Still Believe in Me, but that was not put on the final record. Then Salt Lake City, which was In the Back of My Mind, which was left off. Let 'Em Run Wild, which was on the record. Sloop John B, which was on the record. I'm Waiting for the Day, a Pet Sounds track, which was left off. Wouldn't It Be Nice, You're So Good to Me. Both of those songs wound up on the record. My Only Sunshine, which was a Smile track, and that's a very curious one, that was left off. Wonderful. Again, the Smile version, that was left off, and Good to My Baby, which also was left off. So you had 6 songs, or 6 tracks, I should say, that for the Stack of Tracks project was left off the final running order. 2 days later, on January 11th, 1968, there was an interview with Brian Wilson where he said, we took a picture of a big stack of tapes, which of course wound up being the album cover. I don't know if it'll sell very much, just pure music. It's the first time we've ever put out just pure music. So this record comes out between Friends and 2020. This was not Brian's idea, even though it seems like maybe it would have been. This is Capitol's idea, which is very strange, very odd idea, especially because this is not a time when the Beach Boys music is selling. So to go with an idea like this at that time is odd. And also one note about the record before we talk about the specifics is it's not just a celebration of the Wrecking Crew's work. There are definitely tracks on here that are Beach Boys only, plus Beach Boys augmented by Wrecking Crew personnel. And then, of course, there's Wrecking Crew only. Stack of Tracks comes out on August 19th, 1968. It's 34 minutes, 37 seconds. It does not chart. So it's an instrumental album release containing backing tracks to 15 Beach Boys songs. And as it was issued during one of the lowest commercial ebbs in the U.S. for them, it was the first Beach Boys album to completely fail to reach either the U.S. or U.K. charts. And until Summer in Paradise from 92, it would remain their only official release to have that distinction. And the U.S. version of the album actually included a booklet with the bass lines, lead lines, chords, and lyrics to sing along with in the hopes that it would encourage, I guess, an outbreak of karaoke sing-along parties.
I never knew that. That's very interesting.
And if the version that you have has that booklet, you're in the money because it's a collectible thing at this point. And the European editions contain just the lyrics and a different cover. The record quickly disappeared and it was out of print for 2 decades. In 1990, it was reissued on CD, and again in 2001, both releases without the booklet that accompanied the vinyl. It was a weird one. On CD, the bonus tracks, you also got Help Me Rhonda, Our Car Club, and California Girls. We're not actually going to go into the music per se because, you know, the music is actually talked about in depth, all these songs on the albums from which they came. But there's great liner notes by David Leaf, you know, where he talks about, you know, how this particular package comes out at a point where it was strange that Capitol would even think of releasing an extra record. This was not like 66 or 65 where they were squeezing Brian for product week after week. It seemed like the void that they quote unquote were filling with this product could probably have remained empty and everything would have been just fine. But, you know, 68, 69 is probably the lowest point in Beach Boys history.
I'll tell you what I think. A lot of those bands that became very, very popular in the early days were bands that were easy to emulate. And after the Beach Boys had their go, you didn't hear any other bands trying to sound like the Beach Boys because they couldn't. And that's why Brian Wilson wanted us.
Yeah.
He could convey that. We didn't know where he was going many of the times, but he could convey what he wanted and get it out of us. He knew how to approach us. And he was hearing the vocalese all the time we were recording. He knew where it was going in his brain. We didn't. Well,
I mean, one of the reasons I'm assuming is because he actually suffers from auditory hallucinations. And I personally believe that the voices that he hears are in musical form. And it's a gift from God that, you know, can also be described as an affliction.
Wow. I never heard that before.
Yeah. I talked with Carney about that very thing that I just said, which is, you know, he has auditory hallucinations, and I don't know when they began. You know somebody else who did as well, and that's Jim Gordon. He suffered from auditory hallucinations. And, you know, unfortunately for Jim, it was in a much more assaultive kind of way. But when run through Brian's filter, it came out beautiful through the other end.
Wow, that's such an interesting perspective. I've never heard that before.
So, I want to get back to the Wrecking Crew. So just to address Stack of Tracks one last time here, I just have a capsule review of the record, a real quick overview, and then I want to get back to talking about the Wrecking Crew with you guys. So although admittedly, I absolutely never listened to Stack of Tracks, it sure did sound good when I spun it as research for this episode. It's a total absolute oddity, and even its genesis is a mystery. Why Capitol found it necessary to create Beach Boys product at that time instead of simply letting sleeping dogs lie is beyond me, but I'd love to interview the person responsible for making that particular business decision. Stack of Tracks is a celebration of the type of artistry that by the time of its release, sadly, Brian was no longer either interested in making or even able to achieve any longer. But its dynamism and excitement never abates over time, and even if the idea behind it was to inspire a flurry of karaoke parties across the continent, that's amusing enough to justify its existence, as I've never heard of one of those soirees coming to pass as a result of this thing. If you know anybody, or if you have ever participated in a Stack of Tracks karaoke party, please write in at dave@discograffiti.com and tell me all about it, because my guess is it was a weird and memorable night, and I'm assuming you've got some kind of story to tell. You know, I'm going to say that this is N/A as far as a star rating goes. But if hard pressed, if a guy with a stocking on holds a gun up to my head and said, "What is your Stack of Tracks star rating?" I would probably give it 3 stars out of 5. All right, let's go back to the Wrecking Crew, the history of the Wrecking Crew, or whatever you want to call yourselves, the history of the greatest studio guys ever to walk the planet. So which producer that you worked with was the worst communicator that you guys would talk behind their backs about, I don't know how the hell this guy makes hit records?
Well, unfortunately, what would happen is arrangers sometimes would think they could be producers too. And that's when we get into trouble. We didn't have time to even think about that. One producer, the next producer, oh, that guy was easy to work with. This guy was harder to work with. Why? I don't know why. He just was. Dick Glasser was a great producer at Warner Brothers. He was hired by Jimmy Bowen. And Dick Glasser would have his brother, I can't remember his first name, who was also a producer, to do stuff. He wasn't as good as any of the other guys. Ted Glasser, but he was learning. He was a young guy and he was learning. That didn't mean for us to say we're not going to work with them. We worked with anybody.
Here was a common thing. You guys, it was a very common idea. And the perfect example is Mr. Tambourine Man. You got a great up-and-coming band, but the record company is a little bit nervous about letting the band play on the record because they're not established musicians, especially the drummers. You know, it's like the Andy White syndrome, who replaced Ringo Starr on, the first Beatles record. Since you were always replacing musicians in up-and-coming bands by producers that were hungry for hits, were you commonly disliked by bands at the time?
Yes.
Who
they were jealous of us because they were the touring band. We were the recording band.
Who that you can remember was particularly confrontational with you especially?
No one.
No one?
No.
No one would ever do that.
No.
I don't think so. I don't think that would ever.
I think the only one that had a problem with really, everybody went through it. My dad was a touring musician when he went with Dean Martin in the 50s. And all of a sudden he's doing a Dean Martin recording date, and the guy didn't even know my dad was in the studios, the producer. They all went through it. They all went through, you start here and you go into this. The one that I think was Gene Clark of the Byrds had the more problem with Hal than anybody.
Yeah.
But I never heard of anybody really getting pissed off because, when you see the musicians do what they did, I interviewed David Crosby for the last film, and David went on and talked about it, and he was really pissed. If he was living, he'd still be pissed about that session, the Bird session. So, the music was changing at that point when the Birds, they are able to do some of their stuff. You know what I mean? It wasn't that sometimes the musicians always.
But the funny fallout of that is that Turn, 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 I can't remember the exact number, but there were like
77 takes.
Right. And Mr. Tambourine Man was like 1 or 2 takes, right?
Yeah, I mean, and Don said something earlier. Musicianship started maturing by the mid-'60s, late '60s. Rock and roll, when my dad's doing rock and roll in 1960, it's not that great. It's twanging, it's something that producers and labels thought they wanted to hear. I think it was, yes, you're going to try to get a hit, but it's going to sound like this. Dad's playing, rip-offs of Dick Dale or somebody else, sometimes like the Marquette's albums and stuff. But I really believe once the Wrecking Crew gets to the late 60s, they're matured. I mean, they were always mature. They're much older than the kids that were coming in.
Yeah.
Dad's 30 in 1960.
By the way, do you know how Brian got you guys in his orbit where he was first introduced to you?
Yes, I do. He heard a record that we had done. Steve Douglas was the saxophone player, but he also was contractor for a lot of different companies. And he would hire the musicians for Phil. He went to Fairfax High School with Phil. So they all were very, very close friends. And Brian heard that band and he told Steve, I got to have those guys.
It was actually Jan Berry.
Yeah.
Jan Berry?
Yeah, so what happened was, you guys were riding high, and Brian co-wrote Surf City and then Drag City, and then as a way to keep the wheel of karma spinning, after it became the very first surf song to top the charts, and then, of course, Drag City being a big hit, Jan turned Brian on to the idea of working with you. It was in November of '63. And Jan pointed out to Brian that rather than wait for the touring Beach Boys, of course, at that point, Brian was still touring with them and would be for another year. But rather than wait for the Beach Boys to get off the road to record, he could use the best in the business, plus get his records made more quickly as a bonus. And he'd be able to lighten the boys' load since, the group was traveling all over the place and had enough on their plate. It was like no downside. Do you remember the first session or the first time that you wound up meeting Brian?
Boy, I don't know if it was Good Vibrations or before that.
It was before. It was definitely before.
You got to remember, so many times when we went in, we didn't see titles.
Yeah.
They hadn't put the title of the song on. We just would be looking at a chord sheet or something written out, which was rare, but sometimes somebody would write a part out or something. But a lot of times there was not, so to speak, the name of the song. And then again, a lot of times there was a name of a song, but by the time it came out, they changed it to another name, which happened time and time again.
Don, I don't remember where this lies in the middle or where the timeline is, because Brian was also producing the Honeys. And you were doing a lot of that stuff with them.
Yes, it was.
Is that before or after they might have?
It might have been after. Wow, that's a good question.
That's all during that same era. And in fact, there's a song, Our Car Club, and I can't remember off the top of my head if it's all Wrecking Crew or Click or whatever you were calling yourselves at the time, but it was originally supposed to be a Honeys song called Rabbit's Foot. Yeah. And it was reconstituted as a Beach Boys song and called Our Car Club. And that's how all you guys wound up on that song.
Really?
Yeah.
That's news.
Looking back with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, it's very easy to say, Brian's a genius. He was so amazing. But like you said, you're dealing with this avalanche of music. You don't know the titles. A lot of the times you only have your gut feeling about whether or not it's actually going to be successful. So I'm curious if you knew back then that you were actually in the presence of greatness, that something amazing was brewing in those studios, or is it all these retrospective interviews like what we're doing now and the films like Denny's work that casts all the spotlights down where you understand that Smile and Pet Sounds, that these were works of greatness on a par with Beethoven and the greats? Did you know at the time? Did you really, really know?
I don't think we did. Speaking for myself, I knew that it was very good, I knew with Phil Spector, his genius came out of what he did. And you got to remember, those songs were all great songs. Brian's songs, stuff like God Only Knows and Good Vibrations, that happened out of development. So, in the beginning, you think, wow, this is okay. But then when you hear the final product, you got to remember, Good Vibrations was 3 months, easily 3 months.
It was a total of 6 months.
Six months.
The very first date was February 17th, 66. And the last date, I believe, was in August. It was, I think, 94 hours total in the studio. So what I'm asking you is, we look back on Good Vibrations as a work of greatness. At the time, are you in that studio going, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? 90 some odd hours, is he have a screw loose?
No, that one I can say I did know.
Okay.
That and God Only Knows. God Only Knows. When I heard the lyric to that song, come on, I may not have always loved you. How do you start a love song like that?
Right.
Those two were brilliant. Now, Sloop John B, it was to me, that was a throwaway when I heard it. Help Me Rhonda was in one of the hardest keys for a piano. It was in G flat. Everything is on flats on that one. So it wasn't my favorite one to play, but it became a hit, So I knew that one from the first notes we played it, that was going to be a hit. But God Only Knows, who else is going to be as romantic as that? And that didn't become as popular till years later.
Brian is often, for people who don't know his work, he's often spoken about as an eccentric, as somebody who's maybe a little bit cuckoo. But whenever I hear session tapes, the guy is so on top of it, not only prepared, but totally composed and a great communicator. Was it ever visible to you that he was, starting to fall apart as Smile was progressing, or was he always cool as a cucumber?
I never noticed him falling apart, ever. Thank God I didn't, because it would have really been very hurtful. I respected him and also admired him, because he was so far ahead of a lot of the other producers. He also could convey musically. He knew how to say, make this a minor instead of a major. Put a seventh on this, or could you raise up the fifth? He knew the words to use.
Was he the best communicator as far as producers went?
I don't know if he was the best communicator, but it was Brian Wilson's style.
Yeah.
It's the way he operated. Other guys wouldn't say a word to you. Read the goddamn music. And that would get you in trouble, because a lot of times you would be reading the music and they start screaming at you and the music was written wrong.
Smile was a series of sessions that went on for about 9 months. And then the record never came out. And not only that, but they just stopped suddenly. In fact, the last sessions, I think there were 2 in a row that were just canceled. And then that was kind of it. I mean, there were sessions where he used you guys, but he went back to using the Beach Boys on his records. Do you remember, was there any information, any lead up, or did the calls from Brian just stop?
They just stopped as far as I'm concerned. But you got to remember that we was very busy. If not Brian, it was someone else that we were working for. If we had to count on one artist, then we would be the touring band also, if that's the way it came down.
Right.
But we were studio musicians. We had so many of you be at Capitol. You'd be doing Lou Rawls one day. Another day you'd be doing Michael Jackson. You just, here you are.
Yeah.
That was our whole life.
Let's talk about the darkness creeping in. So we were talking about, Brian kind of losing the plot a little bit with Smile. But of course, we've got Phil Spector, we've got Jim Gordon. I'm talking to both you guys here. And, I did a double episode on Jim. What do you guys think is the correlation between great music and madness? This episode is brought to you in part by Bespoke LA. Located in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles, Bespoke LA is the modern podcaster's dream come true. It's got 2 podcast pods available, one with audio only and the other with both audio and video. Just think, you can start your own podcast tomorrow without investing a single penny in equipment. What, you don't have experience editing? Don't even sweat it. For an additional fee, Bespoke LA can edit your podcast. Or not, it's entirely up to you. Rates start at $75 an hour with discounts if you book 4 sessions at once. Go to bespokela.com/podcast. That's BSPOKELA.com/podcast for more information or to book your time today. And be sure to tell them that Dave sent you for a one-time 25% discount. What do you guys think is the correlation between great music and madness?
You first.
Musicians.
I mean, not everyone. I mean, look, Denny, your dad doesn't strike me at all as crazy. And Don, you don't at all strike me.
No, but they all have their quirks. Everybody, I think anybody, all artists, I'm not all artists, but I mean, a lot of artists, it takes a lot to get to where they get to. Even if you're an amateur, you work at a craft that you really work at. And I think there is something, and you're being judged, when you get to be a professional. And I think of actors, the insecurity of actors, insecurity of musicians, filmmakers. I guess we're all being judged, whether you're an accountant or a musician, but there's something about putting your artwork on display and being judged. And I think that might be the one thing that might make some madness.
How about you, Don? Because I met Don when I was working. I'm a licensed hearing instrument specialist, and I was attempting to fit in with hearing aids. But of course, it's me. So I was mainly talking with him about studio dates and this and that. But, really laying in about Jim Gordon, and you were telling me you experienced it firsthand because in the 70s, I know you had a business venture with him. So, I'm guessing that you saw up close and personal, maybe you noticed a certain decline. Obviously, he's a specific example because he was diagnosable. But did you see up close what was going on with him, that he was declining?
You know what? I have a theory about that. After he came back from Europe, he was another person with touring with Mad Dogs and Englishmen,
right?
Writing Layla, with those guys. After that, he was in another drug place. When he came back after that, he was never the same. I don't think he was capable of doing what he had done earlier anymore either, but that's unfortunate. He probably, had he been straight and stayed ahead of the game, he would have taken over everybody's gigs. That's how good he was. He was a marvelous drummer.
Yeah. The end is sort of around the corner here. And, interestingly, and I don't mean the end of your career, I mean the Wrecking Crew as a thing. There's a few elements in my research here. Interestingly, one of the aspects that led to the end of you guys' association as a playing unit was one of the songs that you did, which was MacArthur Park. So you guys wound up playing on, it was a monster hit, but it was a 7.5-minute song, which contributed to your eventual decline as a playing unit because the longer the song, the less amount of songs are able to be played on the radio. So all of a sudden, there's less need for as much material on the radio. And with fewer songs finding airtime, there was a diminishing number of recording dates for you guys to play on. And then, of course, there was just more bands.
That's the main thing. It wasn't that it was diminishing. The guys were much better. They could do their own stuff.
Right.
They didn't need us anymore.
But then, interestingly, Denny's new movie with the immediate family, we're talking about guys like Larry Carlton, Andrew Gold, Danny Korchmar, Waddy, Russ Conkle, Jeff Porcaro, Leland Sklar, Jim Keltner. Did you guys feel toward those guys as the Byrds felt toward you?
Not at all. Not at all. We worked with together.
Okay.
Leland worked with us. Russ Conkle worked with us. Those guys. I never worked with Cooch Kochmeyer. I never worked with him or the other guys, but I worked with some of them. A lot of times I would be called in to overdub a part that they had fucked up, whereas I was brought in after the fact. So there you have it.
Well, there's no keyboards in the immediate family band, so let's make sure that we got that correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a natural progression. It's not like they're coming in. It's like door opens and door closes. They slowly, everybody gets their, oh my God, I just worked with him. And then all of a sudden you start getting a name. Sooner or later styles change, and fortunately for my father, if he wasn't being able to read and go into television, TV, he would have been dead because, his rock and roll days in records is over. by then. His sound is gone, and that new sound's coming in. Those new guys coming in, don't forget, like he said earlier, they're much more mature as players. Labels are getting to trust the bands that are giving them demos. Now that's why you got Russ Titleman and you got Lenny Waronker. Those guys grew up in the business themselves, and they're starting to produce stuff, and they're using their friends. It just goes that way, and things change.
The most touching party of the Wrecking Crew for me is definitely Hal talking about making $5,000 a week playing with John Denver for about 10 years. Then the gigs end, the jobs end, his marriage ends. He sells his house for a third of what it's worth. His rolls, his gold records, his yachts repoed. And then the great Hal Blaine ends up living in what he describes as a clothes closet, working as a security guard in Scottsdale, Arizona, and thinking about and considering suicide. Was there any kind of correlation like that with your dad, or did the soundtrack composing, did it help?
Here's the one thing is my dad didn't have that Hal had, which was many wives. So, I mean, Hal's
right.
So in a lot of ways, we were ahead of the game. Dad's career, once he got into film and TV, 70s, he was really busy. In 80s, he was really busy, probably up to about, again, looking at contracts and workbooks, probably up to 87, 88, 89. When I say really busy, enough to keep, you don't have to think about taking your pension. What happens is now he gets to the point where it's not so busy. He has a stroke. He has a stroke. I think it was 92. And that last line in the movie, I always say it was, I always remember the line he said to me was, the stroke came at the right time in my life. Now I have an excuse why I'm not getting cold.
That line,
and that's a heavy thing.
That sentence in the movie was heartbreaking. And of course, his song Requiem for a Studio Guitar Player is just heartbreaking, even with the
it's not meant to be. Let's go back on that for a second. For those who don't know, Dad wrote a song because Dad was always voted number one in is it Naris? When they had their yearly awards show, the Naris people. Yes. And Dad was top studio player, top studio player, top studio player. And then one year, Larry Carlton gets it. So he's got to present the award to Larry. So he goes and he dresses up as a ballerina and starts singing. In the 50s, I was something. In the 60s, I was a king. The 70s rolled around. My name don't mean a thing. And then he goes, I've seen great players come and go. I've seen Barney Kessel. And he goes for all the great session players before him that have come and gone. So it's kind of like, it's just a story of, hey, we all have our time. Now it's like, and he says, what was the last line? He says, but Lee Rittenhauer still says hello to me, kidding. And so it's tongue in cheek all the way through. Now, when I use Frank Zappa, to go back to Frank Zappa saying those lines about the Gong Show, Frank Zappa I interviewed in 1980 for another doc. It was a school project on my dad, and it never went anywhere. But I showed him the clip. I showed Zappa the clip. Frank looked at it. He comes back with this very serious monotone opinion about it, saying, it's really sad what happens in this recording business. Tommy has a great sense of humor about it. Da, da, da. Well, I hated it then, but you know what? 30 years later, I used it. Now it makes sense.
Yeah.
You do have your time period.
Yeah.
Tongue in cheek. At least he had a sense of humor about his time period.
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, performing it in a tutu on the Gong Show, that was right.
I guess you better have a sense of humor.
Yeah. I mean, it's the one thing I got from my dad, too, is you don't want to lose your sense of humor no matter what's going on in your life.
No. And the thing is, I was going to say, with all of these guys in, Wrecking Crew and the immediate family folks, they are a very small minority of musicians in the world that have got the success that they have.
Was it Glenn Campbell's Rhinestone Cowboy and Captain and Tennille's Love Will Keep Us Together? 1975, that's kind of where I see the trail ending for the original gang. Playing on these. Of course, I know there was also an ill-fated reunion session with Phil Spector in 92, but 75, was that kind of it?
It was ill-fated because it just didn't happen. There was a number of us from the original band. We never knew who the artist was, come to think of it. We still don't know who the artist was that Jack Nitzsche wrote the charts for, but Jack was too out of it to write the charts.
I thought it was Celine Dion.
Well, no, that came after.
Oh, that's another one.
This is another date. Right before your father had this stroke.
Yeah, I remember he went to that.
He went to that date.
Did Phil call you personally and say, we're getting the band back together?
No, Steve Douglas called us.
Okay.
Steve called us and he said, we're going to do another date. And we never got who the artist was. Celine Dion came afterwards. That one I did get the call from.
How far into the project did you get into with Phil, and what was he like? What was the session like?
The session, Phil and I didn't get along after the Righteous Brothers. He was mad at me because I got called by MGM, who they had signed with, to do their next date. And he couldn't believe that I would go to work for the Righteous Brothers after they left him. We were supposed to be such good friends. And I told him, I said, I'm not on salary, Phil. Yeah. This is my life. This is what I have to do. We can still remain. And then I didn't see him till Jack Nitzsche passed away. And then it was like he was crying and all that. And then, of course, all the rest of the bullshit went down with him. And what can I say? Enough said, so to speak. For me, I kept recording all the way till 85, doing little projects, doing different stuff.
Were the 70s tough for you?
For me, I kept right on going, especially till close to 78, that's for sure. I was doing a lot of different recordings for different people. And I started working for Ray Ruff, who did a lot of albums, a lot of country albums. And a lot of the guys that were in the original Wrecking Crew, he did not use. He used Jerry Cole a lot of times, myself, different drummers, Chet McCracken, who was with my band, and then with the Doobie Brothers. But he liked the way Chet played, so it was a whole other scene. It was mostly country western dates that we did. A lot of them were not union dates. He would pay us the union scale, but he didn't want to file union contracts.
Don, what about other advances that were coming around the bend at that time? Like, instead of having a 4-track where you guys have to play live so you could just get it in one track, now all of a sudden you've got 24-track tape recorders, you've got digital, you've got synthesizers that could approximate the sound of any instrument, and drum machines. Are these things that wound up taking the place of the necessity for studio players?
I think in some instances, yes. But most of the producers now, the younger guys, want to go back to the way we used to do it and record live. Although the advantage they have is, where they're using Pro Tools and all of that, is in the editing is a lot less time.
Yeah.
And the amount of stuff that you can do digitally is kind of an advantage. But still, to get the original thing live is still important to them. And to me also.
Looking back on all the work that you did, is there one track specifically, now that you can look back at the body of work, the massive, gargantuan, looming body of work, is there one track or one album that has in it all the aspects of what it is that you do that moves you to this day more than everything else?
Well, it's always very hard for me to do. The Phil Spector Christmas album will never be repeated. They have tried. Everybody has tried. I mean, almost copying him song for song even,
Yeah.
And I won't say who it is, but she just did it all over again. But that album, spoke for itself. It was way ahead of its time. And it became an annuity for the family. Every year it still sells. As picking out songs, there were so many great songs I got to play on. The instances of Michael Jackson sitting down next to me, Mr. Randi, could you show me what you just played? And that was on ABC.
Yeah.
And how many people can say that? The harpsichord solo on Sound of a Different Drum. There was a guy by the name of Sonny Knight was a producer at Columbia. And he heard something I had done with Jerry Fuller a couple days before. And he hired Joe Sample and myself to play on a group called Spiral Staircase. And I loved that group. I thought Joe and I we're sitting there. I Love You More Today Than Yesterday. What a monster hit that was. Pat Upton was the lead singer in it. And we were sitting there after we recorded that song. Joe and I are looking at each other, and this could be for 3 or 4 albums, Don. Yeah, Joe, I think you're right. We had a future with this band, and they broke up. They never toured. They never did anything. And the record was a top 10 record.
Wow.
And, it's one of my favorites that I've ever got to do. And Pat Upton ended up singing in a bar not far from where the Baked Potato is in Toluca Lake. He was there for like 15 years, someplace right on Riverside and Pass Avenue. He was there forever. In this little juke joint.
What is the song called by the Spiral Staircase?
More Today Than Yesterday. I think that's what the title is.
So is that your favorite song that you have?
No, it's not my favorite song. It's one of them.
Okay.
I have 3 or 4 of them that I really love. I love You Lost That Loving Feeling with Bill and Bobby, you know, and Unchained Melody, that simple piano line that I played, you know, the arpeggios back, da, 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 da. You know, that was me playing that. So
that's unbelievable.
I can take credit for it.
I mean, that song, it's almost like it's not even a song. I mean, it's almost like an emotion unto itself. It's so moving. It's crazy to think that you played all that stuff.
So Bobby comes in one night at the Baked Potato, and he just looks at me, he says, let's do it. And he gets up and, you know, place is packed. And I go right into the intro and we play it. And you could hear a pin drop in there, Bobby singing. And I get to the bridge and I blank. I can't remember where it goes. And he turns around and looks at me and says, you got to be kidding. And I said, I'm not kidding. And it took me a minute till I finally remembered what the fuck I was playing.
Who is the biggest asshole that you've ever worked with in your entire career?
Asshole? Oh, Jesus.
I'm sure there's a lot of competition.
I couldn't pick anybody, really. I mean...
Then pick 3 people.
Pick 3 people? I can't. They all were basically kind, you know, and nobody ever took advantage of the situation. Well, you know, if they did, I wouldn't work for them again. So put it that way, you know. I was given some room. I'll tell you who could be an asshole was Lee Hazelwood.
Really? Wow.
He could really be really tough. I did 110 different albums with Lee Hazelwood. How about that? One producer, LHI Records.
All his solo records are astounding to me.
What about the people he produced on that label? There was a guy there, Arthur Lee. God bless him. He passed away some years ago.
You mean From Love?
Well, no, it's a different Arthur Lee.
Okay.
I also did their record. I did 4 sides with them at Sunset Sound.
Yeah, you were on Forever Changes, right?
Yes, yeah.
One of the greatest albums of all time.
Yeah. People will come in and they'd say, can you play that? No, I can't. You know, for some reason, they expect you to know every song you've ever played on.
Yeah.
So, you know what we did? We did an album called Good Jazzy Vibrations, and we had some fun with it. And we do In My Room in 5/4. We played in 5, not in 4. And Brian called me and says, you're out of your fucking mind. You know that. God bless him. Brian's not feeling that well. You know, he's not in great shape.
He's probably going to be the only Beach Boy not to do this because I don't think he's able to participate.
I don't think so, because he almost came to my birthday party a couple of weeks ago, and I know the guy that works for him very well, Mark London, and Mark said, I just don't think so. Maybe I can get him to call you, but he never called either, so he's not feeling well at all. You would have enjoyed my birthday party because all the piano players, all the drummers, everybody that has worked there for the last 30, 40 years, they all showed up for my birthday party.
That's great.
It was called 88. So all the piano players, 88 keys.
Yeah.
That was it. Everybody played. That we had a Hammond B3 set up for the organ players, the keyboards, and people wanted to play, so it was wonderful.
That's awesome. Of course they wanted to be there. I mean, it's very rare that you get somebody who's not just a legend, but more importantly, just a really good person. You know, they always talk about people, you know, at eulogies and stuff like that, that he or she brightened up a room every time they walked into it. And 9 out of 10 times, it's complete bullshit. They didn't brighten anything up. But, you know, you truly are a shining light.
Oh, I appreciate that.
You're just a good spirit.
I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I mean, to be able to go through all those phases of music, you know, and watch everything change. The only thing that I was disappointed in, and I would have lost a lot of money, I almost bet somebody $5,000 that rap wouldn't be around.
I'm so glad you didn't make that bet.
Oh, let me tell you, boy, did I ever blow that one. Ray Charles said an interesting thing. You can't say rap and music in the same sentence.
Wow. If Ray says it.
I just don't like the abusiveness of it. And it's beats. That's all it is. It's beats.
Yeah.
Very, very basic.
Yeah, and a lot of times, you know, comically enough, they're using the work that you did as a foundation for the music. 2 different
of David Axelrod's records have been used to death with not, and it's not his song. It's my ad-lib piano solo.
Yep. I know what you're talking about. Lil Wayne has a song, and, you know, it's great because it's Axelrod. And I know when they actually went to go look for him to deliver the royalty checks, he was homeless. So, you know, I mean, for some people, it put him back on the map and actually gave him a second life.
Poor David, you know, it's kind of tragic at the end there, you know.
Yeah.
With his son. But that's David's fault. I'll never forgive him for that. He lied.
What happened?
Well, you know, here is his son becoming a drug addict, and Dave Addicts are telling him that he never used drugs. Come on.
He told his son that he never used drugs?
Yeah, he should have not lied to him and said, look, I've used it. It's no good.
Yeah.
But he never did that.
Yeah, David had a problem with cocaine, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don, I can't thank you enough for coming on. You are the greatest human being ever to walk on this planet.
Thank you so much. What a fun interview. Great success, my friend.
Thank you. Denny, I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm so psyched about your career. I know you really just wanted to make this one statement, especially to get to know your dad better, but it's blossoming into an incredible career doing something that you're a natural at.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I'll see you soon.
Bye.
All right, that about does it. The next time I see you all in the context of the Beach Boys and your dream comes true, it'll be 1966, and I'll be one very happy man. As of this recording, only a small handful of guests have been booked for season 3, but one thing I can promise you all is that I absolutely will not be moving forward without the research being properly done. I'm talking about boatloads of research here, and all the right guests booked. I'm banking on a doozy of a collection of folks, a head-spinning cornucopia of how in the hell did you get those people, or else, as far as I'm concerned, I've failed. I'm setting my sights for season 3 of this series as highly as Brian set his on his new music, and as Brian Wilson himself is my muse, I cannot and will not let him down. Nor you, loyal listener. Are you ready to see if I can deliver? Season 3 kicks off on December 22nd, 1965, as Brian exhumes Sloop John B. to begin work proper on Pet Sounds, and concludes on May 19th, 1967, the day on which he cancels the Smile session and gives up. And in between those two dates, a span of a year and a half, lies a lifetime. Stay tuned, because there's a crazy amount of greatness from here till then to keep you glued to your earbuds and car stereos. Mogwai's Stuart Braithwaite discussing and rating Joy Division, Peter Lewis, Don Stevenson, and Moby Grape, each doing their own interview about their own catalog, alongside Skip Spence biographer Cam Cobb doing a Skip Spence series, Dean Wareham doing Galaxy 500, and much, much more. The fun never ends at Discograffiti, so don't go anywhere. Stay tuned, because next week, Mogwai's Stuart Braithwaite tackles Joy Division's catalog in a very special two-parter. Okay, here's the week up ahead. This Sunday, our weekly show within a show, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast, drops for our Patreon's private tier. These are real people with talent and a burning fire deep inside, just like you and I. Then come Monday, the major tier gets a very special treat. A chat with Spaceman 3's Sonic Boom about drugs and kids. Two topics that go together like chocolate and peanut butter. There will be a short sneak peek running publicly for free on Monday morning, but the entirety of the show will only be accessible on the major tier of our Patreon. And then on Wednesday, the Lieutenant tier gets their early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of the Stuart Braithwaite Rates Joy Division podcast. It's the episode as it was truly intended to be heard, with all the essentials left intact. And then come Friday, everybody else gets to join in on the action. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, Don Randi, Denny Tedesco, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, Jay Schultz, Bespoke LA, my mom, my dad, Joe Kennedy for that killer new theme song, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator, and much, much more. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the classic rock and roll from the 1960s is to go to the Beach Boys Season 1, Catch a Wave, 1961 to 1964, from episode 189 on, the Righteous Brothers Bill Medley interview, that's 181 and 182, my interview with the Free Design, that's 160 to 162, my epic interview with the Mamas and Papas Michelle Phillips, that's 141 to 159, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, that's 137, my 12-hour interview with Terry Kirkman and Jules Alexander from the Association, that's 109 to 113, Vashti Bunyan reading her entire output, that's 103 to 104, Sergio Diaz from Os Mutantes, that's 86 and 87, Bert Summer, that's 83 and 84, Sweetwater is episode 79, a tribute to David Crosby, 77 and 78, Andrew Tuttle rates the Monks, 74, Jim Florentine on Black Sabbath is 64 to 68, Lou Barlow on the Zombies is 59 and 60, Marvin Gaye biographer David Ritz rates Marvin Gaye, that's 45 to 47. Blind Faith is 43. Anthony Fantano rates the Velvet Underground, it's 32 and 33. Bob Forrest rates the band is 25 and 27. Monkees manager Andrew Sandoval rates the Monkees, that's 22 and 23. Don Randi rates David Axelrod as 17. Badfinger is 16. The Bee Gees is 10 and 11. Sly and the Family Stone is 5, 6, and 7. And Pink Floyd is 1 and 2. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, April 18th, we're coming at you with Mogwai's Stuart Braithwaite rating Joy Division. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!